Good morning, Team Krulak community. Welcome back to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole on the Russia-Ukraine War. I'm Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer of the Krulak Center. Here is your host, and we welcome back Dr. Yuval Weber, our Russia subject matter expert, to catch us up on what's been going on in the various dimensions of the invasion of Ukraine. So Yuval, welcome back. Good to see you. For those, we just had a great discussion about what's on his sweatshirt, so we might post some links about it in the show notes for those who are really interested in going down the rabbit hole of Soviet era comedy and time travel. But we won't spend too much time on that. So, Yuval, welcome. And as we were talking about here initially, I think first thing we're going to look at is what the military situation is on the ground in Ukraine, especially around Kherson, which has been in the headlines, although sort of movement of the lines themselves on the battlefield has not been quite as dynamic. Anyway, if you want to get underway with us there.
So I think in terms of, moving forward, we'll cover the military situation, then shift into domestic repercussions of basically the last couple of weeks of news, including the imposition of martial law and mobilization. Move on to Putin's last Valdai speech, which I did break out in hives just like a little bit, even just reading it. And then we'll think about what are the international diplomatic consequences thereof. So in the military balance over the last number of weeks, there has not been as much movement. There's been a lot of rumors just in the last overnight, last couple hours, that in the Kharkiv, in the sort of the northern part of the front line, there have been Ukrainian breakthroughs towards Svatove. And that would suggest that if basically the lines are collapsing further and further in the north, Svatove is most important as a railway hub. And the Russians, as we've talked about for the last 8-9 months, are still fairly dependent on railway logistics for getting needed items to the front lines. So if the Ukrainians were to capture that or to put that basically out of play in whatever way, that would help, at least in the northern part of the front lines, return the conflict to something that more resembles the pre-war lines between the two sides. And obviously, if the Ukrainians are moving, they're going to keep moving. What we've seen in Kherson, which has been subject of great concern or great movement over the last number of weeks, there have been Ukrainian nibbles here and there at various settlements. But as of right now, the city of Kherson on the right bank, which is, for our perspective, the western part. And one thing just to remind viewers, sometimes they'll hear right bank, left bank. The Dnieper River flows south. So the right bank is west, the left bank is east, just in that regard. The Russians are still in control of the city on the right bank. But what we have observed in the last number of weeks is the withdrawal of civilian occupation officials. We have seen the Kherson region and Kherson city occupation officials, like the Russia-appointed ones, talking about, like, making direct video appeals to Putin and to the Ministry of Defense for assistance in evacuation into Russia and financial assistance for those who get to Russia. And they have been telling the citizens of Kherson, ostensibly the ones who have been pro-Russia or have been assisting the Russian military or the civilian occupation officials to leave. That, in the same way that, like, Nazi officials were telling their local allies when the Red Army was coming in 44, 45, you need to get to Germany to assure your personal safety. That's the sort of appeals that we've been seeing from Kherson regional and Kherson city officials in recent weeks. We've also observed the general looting of Kherson. And in particular, one of the more interesting things is that the occupation officials and the Russian army have taken fire engines, ambulances, a lot of the sort of specialized equipment that modern cities have. So what could this possibly mean? Taking all the stuff that's worth taking, people and equipment. One variant is it would make it easier for the Russian troops to defend it without having to be worried as much about collateral damage. That said, so the reason that Kherson is really important is that this was the biggest city that fell to Russian hands at the beginning of the conflict. This, as you know, viewers or listeners might recall, was one of the reasons that Zelensky fired his internal security services chief for not predicting or being able to inform that Kherson had been taken over by essentially double agents or people who were willing to work for Russia. Kherson fell without fighting. And so that indicates that the Russians had cultivated local officials to switch sides when the conflict came. So Kherson at this point is still in really good shape, like physically speaking, like as just infrastructure. We've also seen, not just in Russia's historical wars of, Afghanistan in the 1980s, Syria, 2015 onwards, Ukraine over this year, when the Russians fight, they don't really care about civilian collateral damage. They don't care about damage to cities, like actual infrastructure damage. So what this might mean is, one, they want to be able to defend Kherson as the jewel of, the war itself, like the biggest thing that they captured. It's also the capital city of a Russian region, as per the latest annexation and accession to the Russian Federation. But it also could mean that once they remove everything of value, they'll try to hold on to it for as long as possible, but then basically treat Kherson in the same way that they treated Mariupol. It would make no military sense, but it would be much more consistent with destroying things that other people like, just so that other people can't have it. And that might be a way of just destroying things on the way out so as to make, in essence, the value of what Ukraine recaptures that much less. So in that regard, we've also heard over the last number of weeks suggestions from the Ukrainian side that the dam at Novakhovka, which is basically spanning the Dnieper River, which controls water flow out to the sea, that the Russians are going to destroy that dam on the way out. There are roughly 80 settlements, including Kherson, downstream from that, and basically the military point would just be to slow the Ukrainian advances. But it'd also have the effect of just destroying things for the sake that the other side can't have it if the Russians can't have it either. And so the Ukrainians have been talking about this. Western sources have basically been reporting on it, but we haven't seen Western officials taking the damn threat, I guess you could call it, as seriously as basically the nuclear threats that we can talk about in just a minute. But I think that's roughly where we are in terms of the fighting in the north is still going on. The fighting in the south seems to be stalled, but we could see some pretty dramatic movements in the next couple of weeks as the Russians basically make whatever decision of stay or leave as they wish. And then from that point onwards, we'll then see whether the Ukrainians open up, in essence, a third battle vector, basically in between Kharkiv region and Kherson region, through Zaporizhia region into Melitopol and Mariupol, which would then have the effect of cutting the Russian land bridge, Russian land holdings on the west side of the Sea of Azov in half, which would then make the supply of Crimea and Kherson that much more difficult. And that's basically where we've been over the last couple of weeks and what we're probably going to see over the next couple.
So in turn, I guess, kind of indeterminate, I guess, at this point as to whether, Russia is really going to try and make a stand around Kherson, or whether, as you said, they're just going to like grab everything that's not nailed down and get out. We've also talked about the sort of the linkages across the river into that region, particularly to the bridges, which have been a repeated target of Ukrainian attacks, for very specific reasons to disrupt movement in and out. What do we know right now about, even if Russia wanted to do a sort of deliberate withdrawal, what is the capacity over the river right now for them to accomplish that?
At this point, they've spent a lot of energy over the last number of weeks, maybe last 2-3 months. The Ukrainians have gone after the Antonovsky Bridge, which is one of the big ones, and the bridge across Nova Hakova as well. So a lot of the big bridges are no longer usable for heavy transport. So the Russians have put a lot of energy into constructing pontoon bridges, inclusive of pontoon bridges with basically like metal on top of them. Some combination of iron and steel, so as to provide for heavier transport. The Russians construct them, the Ukrainians go after them. The Ukrainians, once it became clear that the Russians were taking a lot of things with them, the Ukrainians slowed down in the bombing of those pontoon bridges, anticipating or sort of assessing that the Russians are leaving. And so there is some balance, I'm guessing, within the Ukrainian military leadership. How much do you want them? How much do you want the Russians to leave versus how much do you want them to just be kettled and trapped in Kherson so that you basically destroy as much of the enemy as possible, but you also raise the costs of basically recapturing Kherson city and certainly raise the possibility of Kherson city looking more like Mariupol than not. And so that's the sort of trade-offs that we're not privy to, but that's what it seems that the Ukrainians are doing, is trying to figure out what's the right balance between letting the Russians take their stuff and people across these basically armored pontoon bridges, or basically just trying to kill as many people and destroy as much stuff as possible. And that's a Ukrainian decision.
Yeah, no, and that's not to get into doctrine, but that's that's the horns of the dilemma on the friendly side.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know, I'm on the one hand, I'm definitely confident the last thing they want is more, liberating piles of rubble if they don't have to. Although, any intact Russian forces that make it across, you may have to face again at some point when they've had a chance to recover. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's hard decisions.
Yeah. The and just sort of like I guess the last thing on this, let's harken back to what was like Ukraine's operational success here, is that they kept talking about the Kherson offensive and this is something that we talked about previously. They kept talking up the Kherson offensive in order to draw Russian forces south from Kharkiv. Once the Russian forces were in Kharkiv, or from Kharkiv into Kherson, from north to south. And that's when the Ukrainians did the surprise counteroffensive in the north across Kharkiv region, where the Russians were basically undermanned. So the successes we saw in the north were because those Russian forces had gone south. Those are the forces that we're talking about, the ones that basically came from north to south. And now the decision has to be on both sides: stay, go, and in what fashion.
Okay. So that's, I guess that kind of gets us up to where we are on the military, sort of the frontline situation. I think the next thing we wanted to hit was what's going on in sort of the more domestic side, um, both within Russia as well as, the newly annexed territories that they don't fully control, but are yet somehow part of Russia. Now, one of the things that was I think it happened a couple of days after we did the last rabbit hole episode, was the imposition of martial law on some of the, well, I think it was on all of the occupied territories or the annexed territories, but also is in some of the westernmost Russian provinces. Is that correct?
Yeah, and Western Russia as well. So yes, so martial law, uh, lots of things can happen under martial law. In the annexed territory, this is the forcible conscription. And given that I am not a professional sailor or Marine, Ian, can you tell me, am I allowed to use the word press gang if we're talking about people on land? Can people be press
I
ganged onto service if they're not going onto a ship?
I think in the strictly historical sense, you could, because that was a method that was largely used by the Navy, or older navies. But I think it's more a description of a form of conscription, highly involuntary. Like, conscription is involuntary, on any day, but in sort of our more modern systems, like, you sort of at least know that you're eligible. Whereas press gangs back in the um, you know, late, 18 or 18th, 17th, 19th centuries was, yeah, basically, recruiting parties from the ship would go around and find, you know, drunkards, thieves, or whatever, or people who couldn't really protect themselves and just like overwhelm them by numbers and drag them off to the ship. And hey, you're part of the crew now. Congratulations. Um, I think it's still it's a fair description of it's a recruiting technique.
So as a recruiting technique, with your permission, I think we can say that what the Russians are doing in occupied territories to a great extent, little less in Russia, but effectively all over the entire country, is press ganging able-bodied men into service against basically the Ukrainian adversary. And in that regard, one thing that we've seen is, or one sort of question that is raised from that is it a good idea to effectively kidnap people to then give them like weaponry? In terms of the mobilization, President Putin's Secretary of Defense or Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, called it a partial mobilization and said that 300,000 would be mobilized. Recently, there was an estimate done by some economists who published an article in one of the Russian opposition media outlets that had an estimate of 500,000 or roughly 500,000 people who have been mobilized in Russia. And we'll get to sort of the Ukrainians in just a second. Their identification strategy of how they came up with this number was a little interesting, because what they did is they found obviously publicly available data on like the Russian census, like how many people live in each region, but also publicly available information was how many marriages are there on any given day in Russia. Again, sort of generic, publicly available, vital health statistics, as it were. So what they did was they noticed usually in Russia, it takes 1 month from basically registering your marriage with like the local office that does that sort of thing to actually being able to be married. Ostensibly a cooling off period. There's no Las Vegas style. So one of the things of the mobilization, one of like its aspects, like once there is mobilization, martial law, or mobilization, I should say, is that the 1 month waiting period is waived. And obviously, ostensibly, if people are being mobilized, they can get married more or less on the spot. And so that if they don't return, their newly minted and very fresh widow is able to get the monetary benefits from their death or disfigurement or whatever else, sort of normal stuff that happens. So what the authors of this article did is to observe, since marriages are publicly reported data, what is the spike in basically marriages once the mobilization was announced? And so from there, what is basically the difference between normal marriages and excess marriages? Knowing the census, they were able to come up with a figure of, estimating how many people in each region wanted to basically define the relationship before they were going. Use that as how many people are in a relationship but not yet ready to get married, as just a total subset of men within a region, given the age, given the normal numbers of how often people get married. And from that, they extrapolated there's 86 regions in Russia, or 83 regions in Russia, and 3 special like cities, like Sevastopol, Moscow, St. Petersburg. So they had data for about 50, 55 regions, took it to the rest of the country, and were able to come up with an estimate that the partial mobilization was 492,000. And so their view was there's roughly 500,000 people who just went into armed services. Then looking at the population like booms and all the countries where Russians can still go, as well as like places where Russians were able to get visas, from the population waves of February, right when the war was starting, June when the school year in Russia ended, and from the mobilization over the last couple of weeks, to estimate that there have been somewhere between 500,000 to 750,000 people who have also left Russia, but not to the army, to then assess there might be 1 million and beyond of individuals who are no longer part of the workforce in Russia. This is an economic hit because this is, the most economically vital people in the entire country, given like their age. And so that helped motivate, to a certain extent, martial law, because martial law means the government gets to, in effect, temporarily nationalize economic activity. They can basically, and again, I've been reading a lot of history on like the Napoleonic era and basically like those wars. Um, can I use the word dragoon when it comes to workers in a civilian enterprise being forced to work for the government?
There was actually recently a Twitter thread on the origin and nature of the word dragoon, both as a technique and as a type of soldier. And I totally didn't read it, so I can't
Gotcha.
say one way or the other. So I'll allow it. Just go ahead.
Okay. Um, Usually I'd use these words with abandon, but given like that our viewers and listeners actually know the difference, I want to have like that much more humility. Um, but what the main effect of the martial law is for Western Russia is that economic activity can be devoted to the war effort directly. And so this gives the government as well as government contractors. And government contractors are not like how they work here in the US, in which, there's some sort of contracting process. This is, you know, those either agencies or departments or large enterprises which are directly connected to the Kremlin, to Putin. They can take things from the regular economy that they need without having to go through the usual structures of Russian labor law. And so this is going to be, as we're speaking, are we going to see, like the devotion of civilian factories to military equipment as it was in World War II? Like maybe, maybe not. But what we are going to see is this permits government insiders and basically regime loyalists and supporters to engage in basically economic warfare against their rivals. The closer you are to Putin, the more you're able to take the stuff of others under the guise of it's for the war effort. So we're seeing, because Russia's economy is not doing well, because the Russian government wants to save its oil and gas money, that means we're seeing a scramble for resources basically at at the levels underneath that within the economy. And so this is the struggle of all against all under the guise of preparing the state for indefinite military conflict. And obviously, like, what word are we seeing in terms of the mobilization? This is, as we've talked about before, this is the first social media, smartphone enabled conflict in which we're able to view the front lines every single day around the clock. So there have been just scores of videos of basically mobilized people who are either like still at their training base and just filming the decrepit conditions that they're in, complaining about no training, clearly scared, clearly unprepared, all the way to videos of people who are in the field and who don't have any protective equipment. They don't have weapons. They don't have ammo. They don't have, and the thing that they complain about the most in these videos, which basically is like an SOS message more than anything else, that they're cut off from their commanders and they don't have orders. So they're in a field in Ukraine without any way to protect themselves or any idea of what to do and without training of how to do it. And so this brings back, very ancient views on what, you know, what is the way of war when you do not care about the lives of your soldiers. That Putin and the people around him are putting men in the field not to do anything, but merely to serve as human ground meat, just to slow down Ukrainian advances and just to soak up Ukrainian artillery. And the people at the front understand their only purpose there is to die and basically keep the Ukrainians from advancing or winning by that much more. And that is clearly the panic that the people in these newly mobilized troops are expressing in order to basically break through the informational barriers at home to try to get some support.
Yeah, I think you described this previously as a casualty intensive mode of warfare, and um, I think to us, in the American and Western militaries, it's just a completely alien concept that you would drop people out there and not give them anything and just expect them to use their bodies as speed bumps. Like, if I want, anyway, the best way to slow somebody down is to give your people the method to fight back and make that advance incredibly painful, and slow, and maybe make them go somewhere else, but not the Putin approach. I mean, arguably not the Russian approach to warfare for a while. Sorry, go ahead.
No, and so I mean, before the war, a lot of people looked at what was Russian doctrine. We've seen over the course of this conflict is the first idea didn't work, and then they're all out of ideas. And so therefore, it's appeared to me, and we've been doing this for like what, 8, 9 months at this point. It's that their big ideas, like Putin's big strategic ideas, like has devolved into trying to basically win the next week, win the next 2 weeks. And basically the decisions taken to solve the problem right now means that he's created a bigger problem for himself a couple weeks down the line. And that is the difference between having strategy, thinking through your operational concepts to allow people down the line to make the correct tactical decisions versus not. And so now we're in a position where this is like early days of, so like someone on Twitter said, Putin started this war by pretending it's 1945. And, this is like the last stages of liberating occupied land from the Nazis. And the more this war has gone on, the earlier in the war, they're actually having to do this. And this is like 1941. You're just basically putting untrained, unprepared people to slow down the adversary's advances. And again, the Russian phrase for cannon fodder is ground meat.
And yeah, that's a very striking visual image. But it's interesting. You sort of describe that travel back in time. You'd mentioned, I think several episodes ago, maybe midsummer, how like the Russian, you know, sort of military structure as a whole was going from like 21st century back to 20th, and in some cases 19th in terms of like equipment and how they were supplying. But now their manpower model is going backward in that same sense too. From a standing, trained professional force to, you know, throwing bodies under tank treads in the hope that the bump slows them down a little bit. To the martial law thing, I want to just one more question on
Sure.
that before we go on to something else. Is um, martial law is something usually declared when you're at war. And as far as I know, this is still a special military operation, correct? So in terms of like talking about popping through that information barrier, has there been anything on whether it's the Russian state media or the Telegram channels or what have you that has noted this dichotomy? We're in martial law now, but there's no war still.
There's
Are we squaring that circle in any way?
there's a great Russian phrase from the 19th century. Umum rasion не понят. You do not understand Russia with your mind. That's going to be my next sweatshirt, by the way. Um, and in that regard, it's like just don't bring up the war. There's a war going on. They cannot admit it's a war because then that puts the entire war, by calling it by its name, it makes Putin look bad because this was a 3-day operation and we're in day what, 250 at this point, something like that. We are so many months into this special military operation and so far down that the only thing that, again, the reason they don't call it a war, one, it would humiliate Putin, and two, it would then give all the people, bringing up really crazy ideas on like the Russian political talk shows, basically that much more ammunition to take the fight to whatever they think is the next level. So we have, in a larger sense, everything that comprises of a war, except the word, and the word is basically the last thing holding. Um, I would say, like in sort of like the Russian political thinking, it's the last thing before understanding that we are in the end days of Putin. And I say that directly because everyone in Russia knows, like every single talk show that I watch, um, they know that this is serious. If they call this a war and basically the Ukrainians win, which they understand is happening, like they do talk about like literally the stuff that's happening on the battlefield. It's not that they're giving false information. They give the basically factual information, but then come up with these outlandish ways to describe, no, we're just retreating to fight from, a stronger, more defensible position. They tell the basically accurate things, but come up with these crazy like interpretations. If they call it a war and the Ukrainians win, how can Putin survive in terms of like the political dissension? Now, an obvious answer that no one also wants to say is that Putin would then engage in coercion and purges to the level that we probably have not seen since Stalin's times. That's the natural conclusion. If you lose a war to maintain power at home, Putin would then need to find the people who are responsible for this debacle. For a fiasco of this size, the number of people responsible will go across the entirety of society. And so Russian society will then become that much more violent. That's the thing that people in Russia intuitively understand. If somebody has to be blamed, then everyone will be blamed. And it's basically people saving their skins that will create, in essence, not just the administrative chaos, but truly violence of people killing each other, a lot of people going to jail, all those sorts of things. And that's the core sense of panic that Russian people have gone through many times in their history that Putin wants to avoid. Not that he can't control it, but then his focus has to go from Ukraine war to shoring up basically power at home. And that's a time and money and blood intensive way of spending your day. And so that to an extent is why do they do all the things that you would do in a war, but not call it? Because it then raises the domestic political stakes at home.
Yeah, and I can imagine in that concern about the purges, part of the potential violence is that some of those people are not going to just lie down and go quietly, right? Some of those people, especially if they're in the military or security apparatus and they're going to be the fall guy, right? Well, you know what? They have guns and they control people who have guns too. And so I would imagine that the chances of very violent internal civil conflict is a very, very real thing, and certainly something that Russia has seen before as well. Although it's been a while, but I imagine that's still in their sort of collective memory.
So certainly, like, and so you can think, what deals would Putin have to make with like some military commanders versus others? Like, don't worry, Ivanov, like you're cool, but it's Petrov who's like at fault, and then setting the army at each other. But then also have to make deals with basically the people who win those internal conflicts in order to have that military support to buttress his rule. Same thing with like the FSB and intelligence services, setting them at each other and going with the winner, but being beholden to that winner. We can also see that there's a lot of like latent ethnic hostilities and antagonism. Those are now like coming back to the fore because there's been mobilization across the country with a heavy emphasis on ethnic and poorer regions. Once soldiers start to come back, having experienced something truly horrific, they're going to basically not be treated like that twice. We also know that, like with Wagner recruiting just prisoners directly, who's going to be the core of like the next wave of Russian organized crime? Military trained, like prison convicts, like felons who are already open to the idea of preying on the weak and defenseless. And so when we start to have like lots of these things coming together, you can start to see that violence across regions, across social groups, across institutions, across agencies, that might be a normal state of affairs for some period of time until winners emerge from basically these battles. And that is the sort of thing that is like very predictable, and what Putin and the people around him definitely want to avoid, people starting to put into their calculations of what their future looks like.
Yeah, and as you were just describing that, it's literally like across the whole country and across all the levels of society. Another horrifying little asterisk to that is I don't know if we have seen massive civil disorder and civil war in a nuclear armed country before. I'm trying to think of a historical analog because there's only we only have a few decades of that, and I can't think of one. So that's another you know future possible timeline that is not pleasant to consider. Um,
Yeah, because I was trying to think what was the 1990s. At least in the 1990s within Russia, there was certainly like civil disorder from moments to moments, the breakdown of just like the government, but the army was in control of its nuclear weapons. And there were like ethnic conflicts within Russia, and obviously like the Russia-Chechnya war, um, which secessionist conflict. But the military at the top levels was stable from Soviet times to Russian times. The same people. There were no large-scale purges or lustration there, and there were conflicts outside of Russia within former Soviet Union, but not in places where there were nuclear weapons. So this would be fairly novel, um, unless we're just not thinking of some aspect of or definitely like how maybe some political scientists would code what happened in like Pakistan, Afghanistan type things.
yeah, like Pakistan was sort of the you know the only other thing I could sort of think of, and I don't think has ever experienced the potential like geographic and cross strata potential disorder of of like a top low like a purge that Putin potentially undertakes if things continue to go very badly. I mean, Pakistan's always been it's always been on a knife edge, in terms of the control of its leadership and the stability of its its political situation. But I don't think it's ever been on such a knife edge that there were serious concerns about what was going to happen with its nuclear weapons, and also they just don't have as many as Russia. Like not we're not
Yeah,
even talking the same same categories. I mean a nuclear weapon that goes astray is definitely bad, but Russia has lots and lots and lots of them, lots of them.
I
So
think something like 6,500, and we have something like 5,300. Those may not be exact, but I think that, and everyone else is like
like you're
three
talking,
digit numbers.
one like onesies and twosies. Uh, and unless we're talking about some of the other, Western countries that have had nuclear programs, but sort of outside of that, yeah, you're not talking large numbers of warheads, and there's nothing that compares to the Russian stockpile. Um, so I guess we can maybe get to the nuclear
Yeah.
piece here in a second. Um, I think there was an opportunity to make a John Cleese joke about not talking about the war, but I think that moment has gone. So
Yeah.
um, we'll move on to the next thing. So another discussion point we had was that Putin gave a speech. I think it was yesterday, and I think it was to a discussion forum. The name of it I'm not going to try and pronounce, but if you want to
The
like give it, what's that?
yeah, it's called the Valdai International Forum, I believe. But Valdai is like a place. So like there's a place Valdai, and every single year the Russian president basically hosts foreign international relations, foreign policy experts, basically academic elites from different parts of the world, from across the world, to basically just like listen to him, in first person.
And I'm sure that's a very pleasant experience for all the guests who were brought there. But so what did he talk about in this recent one that he gave? Are there any? I know we mentioned there's sort of some consistency in the talking points that he goes out, but was there anything that any little nuggets that jumped out at this one that are topics worth watching in the future, or is he just reading from the same script again?
Right. So for a lot of people who go, they get to feel like, oh, I listened to the Russian president, and I have not gone because I don't think I'm, let's say, famous enough for that sort of thing. But like the giants of, like, let's say Russia studies in in academia have gone, and their descriptions like what it's like in person is, first of all, you get to meet the president, like the president of Russia, and he only makes, basically, he only interacts with the public. He doesn't really interact with the public, like the people writ large. He only does that if there's an election coming up. So to actually see this man in person, he only even makes speeches to like his parliament or to like various governmental bodies no more than like once, twice a year. So first of all, there's the feeling, oh my God, I'm doing something very, very special here. Two, like when you go there, it is the full wining and dining. It's like you are definitely treated like a very important person. And so then you're in, psychologically, you've been framed to accept whatever he says as like true, right, correct, etc. So like that's just basically like the room where he's talking. The views, and again, for viewers, listeners, you could read or watch with subtitles this particular speech, and you're pretty good on basically most Putin speeches. They're all roughly the same at this point. They're just more or less tailored to the audience in terms of using either metaphors or language that that audience is already familiar with. But in effect, first there is the listing of the grievances. Russia's core grievance or Putin's core grievance is that the United States is bad. Like that's like from first principles, we operate that the United States is bad. Now, why is the United States bad? The international order from Putin's perspective should have started in 1989 with the conclusion of the Cold War, when obviously like George H.W. Bush, Mikhail Gorbachev walked away from their meetings in Malta, December 1989, thinking that they were going to negotiate amongst the two countries what are the rules of the road. How do the US and USSR interact with each other? How do they reshape the international security architecture, the European security architecture? How do they jointly govern international affairs? Soviet Union exists, Red Army is big and strong, lots of nuclear weapons. That's the international system that Putin wishes that he inherited. The international system that he inherited from Yeltsin, and which Yeltsin basically helped speed along, was that the Soviet Union collapsed. The US increased its power at Russia's expense. Every single country in between Russia and West Germany wanted to become part of the European Union and or NATO, with the glorious exception of Belarus, which basically has a sort of a mini Putin there too. And that's what's unfair. And so that's America's original sin, was not upholding its 1989 spirit to take advantage of the 1991 moment. So therefore, everything that America has done since is to take advantage of that period and to institute unipolarity, to expand, and then to basically export its values onto everyone else in the world. So America is unjust. It has done things that are immoral, illegal, etc. And that its worst sort of thing that it does is not just be powerful, but that it uses its culture and values to brainwash people of the non-West into thinking the West is right, true, and correct. And so he spoke at length on beyond the sort of like general appeal to the global South, that what we need is less America in the world. We need to create multipolarity, and Russia, just as it so happens, is one of the poles of the multipolar world. But he also had this long discussion on there was Dostoevsky and other giants of like Russian literature talking about cancel culture and talking about the values of the West. And we do not have the time, and I do not have the insanity to go through like Dostoevsky's body of work. But one of the core themes of Dostoevsky's body of work is, what is man's responsibility to man, to society, and to God? And so one of his famous characters, Raskolnikov, kills an old lady. But why does he kill an old lady? Because he believes that he can do better and more in this world than the old lady. Also happens to be his landlady, but like, we'll leave the economic concerns to the side. But because he can do more than her, removing her from the world and having more of him in the world is basically the sacrifice both she and he need to make. But and so for the betterment of society, for the betterment of themselves, and for basically the obedience to God, in order to have, in essence, a more fair, right, and just world by removing those who are weak and promoting those who are strong and better able to do something. Of course, he gets punished. That's the transition that Putin made to Western cancel culture. That you do the things that are right, and then basically all those ninnies and wussies in the West will then, circle the wagons and attack you for being yourself. Again, I die a little on the inside every time I have to go over this, but that's where we are as a leader of a nuclear armed nation. And so what he was doing in that is trying to appeal to all of those on an ideological basis. If you do not like Western culture, if you do not like Western values, then you're the person who's right. And if you're the person who's right, in essence, the West is wrong. That provides the ideological basis for organizing international affairs outside of the United States and its partners and allies. And that was his global South appeal. And that then turns into, what does Putin talk about when he talks about Ukraine? He doesn't talk about Ukraine in terms of its borders, like a physical place. And this is how we can get insight into his views on war termination. His problem with Ukraine is not its borders. The parts that he's annexed and is going to try to hold on to, he's going to try to get more and more. But it doesn't matter, in a sense, the actual borders of Russia, Ukraine. Like obviously in like a logistical sense and an operational sense, it does. But the thing that offends Putin is not Ukraine as its borders, but Ukraine as its idea that it is governed, organized, and motivated to be part of that West. And that when he views Ukraine as basically a garrison state or frontier state of the West, that's essentially the motivation here. What Ukraine should be, according to Putin, is the frontier state for Russia. That if there is to be a buffer zone, buffers are protecting one side or the other, and it should be protecting Russia. And so when we then think about what is going to make Putin like happy with the conflict, with the resolution of this conflict and war termination, it's only the destruction of Ukraine as basically a post-Maidan country. And so therefore, when we then think about what are, peace negotiations that Putin wants, any of the peace negotiations that Putin would seriously consider are only things to freeze the existing territorial revision in place, to then give him and Russia the time to regroup and reconstitute its forces for another, basically another phase of the conflict. The only negotiation that he would take seriously is something that has that, and that he does with the American president, because he doesn't want the humiliation of having to deal with the Ukrainian president as an equal. And those are basically the big views from the speech. Grievances and resentment, appeal to the global South, and the articulation of a world in which you don't have to apologize for yourself.
Yeah, well, I think that last point, like the world he's looking at, versus the world, the West is kind of looking at, as you just described it, but as we talked about this before recording, is there's a massive gulf between the two, whereas we on the the for Ukraine, it's a fight for survival, like that's as basic as it is, but on the Western side, we're looking at this as a regional conflict to which we're contributing support, but it's a regional conflict nonetheless, confined to certain things. For Russia, it's not, maybe it's not existential, but it's global.
Yeah.
This is a clash of global viewpoints and perspectives, and in terms of war termination, like understanding that gap, I don't know how you come to a war termination that, you know, not just as just, right? You know, as is just for all sides, but you know, has any realistic possibility of not brewing into another conflict years down the line. Um, you
It
know, don't know how you get there from here.
You can call it a clash of civilizations.
I didn't want to.
Uh,
um,
for, for those who are listening and not watching the YouTube, please note that Major Ian Brown of the United States Marine Corps just died a little uh, when I made a Huntington reference. But in that regard, what it's exactly as you put it. Russia's viewpoint is this is a global contest with local fighting that has regional implications. The local fighting between Russia and Ukraine shapes Europe, which basically shapes how does the United States interact with Russia as fellow great powers. And the perspective from, as you put it, like the perspective from basically everyone else in the world is this is a local war that has regional implications, but this is not a global contest. Like the US, NATO, other countries are not fighting in this war. And that's the core difference. Russia's fighting for a very different world, and everyone else views Ukraine as fighting for its survival.
you know, they're just mutually incompatible perspectives, and um, you know, it'd be, as you said, you know, at best you freeze it, and people. I mean, maybe I think the challenge is by freezing it, it gives the implication that the conflict is over, which would not be the case, because until the world changes, you know, or until Putin departs this mortal coil, right? His perspective is not going to change. So
Yeah,
you're only you know kicking the can down the road until he decides to, you know, as freezes it long enough to reconstitute, you know, rebuild, you know, maybe retrain his meat grinder soldiers and try again.
there is zero doubt that Putin is willing to wage this war indefinitely. That, and this is, we can go to sort of like what are the international diplomatic consequences of Putin's war, is that where we start with the idea that war termination from Putin's perspective is basically the disemboweling of Ukraine. Again, the key thing isn't how much territory that Russia takes, um, how much population he can gain to, cover the losses from the war, from emigration, and so forth. But it's Ukraine as being able to articulate sufficient sovereignty to choose its own foreign and security policies, to choose its own economic policies. That's the core thing. Putin doesn't need to control or like annex literally the entirety of Ukraine. Like even from the beginning of the conflict, it was clear that was not part of the capabilities. But but basically removing the current leadership and installing loyalists, that I think is like still like a clear Russian like desire that the fighting will continue until the Ukrainians come to their senses.
Yeah, I mean, he essentially wants, you know, what he's got in Belarus right now, right? He
Yeah,
doesn't occupy or, you know, have direct control over every aspect of, you know, life and economy in Belarus, you know, but he has, it's his satellite, you know, to sort of do with as he requires. And that's kind of probably the same model he's looking for it with Ukraine as you describe
right.
it.
And that's so like that's the core difference. What was the Soviet Union and what is imperialism? The Soviet Union is Moscow made decisions for everyone and paid for everyone. That was, by the way, Boris Yeltsin, that was his key complaint about the Soviet Union, is that the Soviet Union was bad for Russia, just as a deal. And that's why he took, Yeltsin with his colleagues from Belarus and Ukraine, taking their countries out of the Soviet Union was in order to stop sharing their resources with the Caucasus and Central Asia. Like just at its core, like that is the origin story of the Russian Federation, the current state. And so for Putin, as you put it, he wants that same imperial relationship with Ukraine as he has it in Belarus. And if he were to get basically a very different government, a government that is Now you would think it's impossible because it would require super violence to keep them in power. But at the beginning of the war, if Zelensky had left and Viktor Medvedev had been installed as the president of Ukraine, the war would have stopped immediately. Like that, and so that's in essence the reason that the Ukrainians are going to fight on an indefinite basis, and why Putin is no longer thinking about how do we defeat Ukrainian forces in the field. That essentially, like, that's been revealed that Ukraine has more capabilities, it has better morale, all these sorts of things. The costs of defeating them are very, very high, even though the benefits remain the same. And so this is, transitioning into like, how does Putin think about war termination? Is how does he think about basically Western support to Ukraine? We talked earlier in like this series when we had Dr. Rita Konayev on about different sorts of clocks. And the clocks that we talked about at that time were which one's going to run out first, Western support for Ukraine or basically the Russian economy. Putin is going Leroy Jenkins on the Russian economy by pursuing policies, or is going all in, I should say, for those who are not online, who's going really like to the max on like Russia's economy by doing things such as mobilization, doing things such as having martial law, hundreds of thousands to like let's say in the low million of people who are basically outside of the labor force because either they're in the army or they're outside the country. So we're going to see the contraction of Russia's economy, not just from basically this exogenous shock to like the labor force, but also the effects of sanctions, the prohibition of imports of like semiconductors into like microchips into Russia, Russia having to recreate brand new supply chains, the deglobalization of Russia, all of these different things. It's not any one thing is going to collapse the Russian economy, but all of these things happening at once. This is a clear march towards a bad economic place for Russia. So the only thing that Putin can really do in order to get to war termination on favorable terms, to get to negotiations from a position of strength, are to reduce the support that the larger West gives to Ukraine. That is why we see all these nuclear threats coming up, and we can go into whatever level of detail, but like my personal hot take is we are unlikely to see Russia use nuclear weapons because that really does provide Russia with the global contest that it claims that it's fighting, but obviously is not. And so and this is something that the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, has said, President Macron of France has said, Josep Borrell, one of the top EU officials, has said that the response is not going to be nuclear in response, but it is going to be devastating. And so what does devastating mean? The mind can expand in many different directions, but one would expect that attacks on Russian soldiers in the field, attacks on Russian military assets in the field, attacks on basically Russia's Black Sea Fleet or Caspian flotilla, truly eroding and corroding Russia's ability to wage war might be the response. That would then hasten all of those bad domestic consequences that we were discussing earlier. So again, the threat of nuclear weapons helps shake resolve in a lot of countries because they get back to conversations that we could have had in 1950. Is the United States willing to trade Boston for Kiev? Are they willing to trade Charlotte for Odessa? And those are the same conversations that were all throughout the Cold War. And why Russia's bringing them up now is basically try to erode Western support for Ukraine and hopefully having more pro-Russian leaders come to power in various countries as their election cycles come up. What we've seen at minimum is the far right candidate, basically fascist supporter at least, or fascist nostalgia person in Italy come to power. We've also seen that in Sweden, the very far right, which has its origins in a neo-Nazi movement, is part of the coalition that just came to power. But both in Italy and in Sweden, there has been no change from the status quo in terms of support for Ukraine. Now, my own hot take is that both the Swedish party as well as like the Giorgia Meloni in Italy have basically recognized that the United States and its basically allies and partners view Ukraine as basically you have two choices. You are on board, or basically you're in the pro-Russia camp. And if you're in the pro-Russia camp, that comes with diplomatic, political, and economic consequences that you do not want. And so therefore, if your actual goal is let's be anti-immigrant or whatever else in our own countries, support for Putin, support for Russia going against Ukraine is basically just a cost, is basically the juice is not worth the squeeze. And that is in essence what we're seeing. Russia trying to create dissension. It obviously gets people very hot and bothered, but it as yet isn't bearing any fruit. We also know that over the last couple of weeks, the European Union announced that it reached all of its gas storage goals ahead of this winter, aided in part by trying to buy up as much gas as possible, but also by it's been a relatively warm autumn, so they just haven't needed as much gas. This suggests that Russia, its original intent that the West would prefer a political deal over Ukraine's head that ensures cheap gas forever, that they would prefer that over basically backing Ukraine. They didn't get that, so they used the gas weapon. The gas weapon was not as effective as they had hoped, creating the conflict in, domestic economic conflict. And obviously, they wanted to do this before the G20 summit, which at this point is now about 2.5 weeks away. They wanted something in place so they could use that opportunity to have a Putin-Biden discussion, meeting of the minds. But Biden's people have indicated that Putin will come
Not
nowhere
going to happen.
close. Yeah. So
Yeah.
hopefully we'll see the Putin's federal security office, his basically his secret service versus Biden's secret service. Maybe they can do a bit of judo in the hotel lobby to see if the leaders meet.
Yeah, maybe I don't know. A sharks versus jets dance off,
Yeah.
kind of thing. And yeah, no, but I think bringing up the various clocks again is we're certainly not through the winter yet, right? And some of the things you described in terms of the changes in political leadership in Europe, not yet impacting support for Ukraine, as well as a not as bad as expected gas situation. We've I hate to, I'm going to say it anyway. Winter is coming. It's still coming, right? And there's a lot of things that can happen in that time frame. But it could be that these are the first inklings, at least, that once again, like Putin's assumptions and calculus have just been badly wrong, because and they've consistently been wrong in how he thinks individuals or nations are going to respond to what he does. And I know that one of the other calculus is, hey, U.S. has got an election coming up too, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that's one of the clocks he's watching. But aside from the election campaign rhetoric, I think I saw some recent polling that there's still very strong majorities in the U.S. in support of continuing to provide material assistance to Ukraine, and I want to say that polling also included potentially bad economic, higher gas prices, what have you, on our side, still very strong majorities indicating that they would, continue to support, or we should continue to support Ukraine through that. So, again, could be Putin has badly misread the field, and he's going to find whatever happens in the elections is not going to impact the support, and then what does he do? I don't know, and he's running out of weeks that he, as you said at the very beginning of this, he's thinking a week at a time. Once you're going to run out of weeks that you can just you know, defer certain painful things. And maybe he finds this winter, the weeks he thought he had, he's run out, actually. We'll see.
Again, strategic genius.
Yeah.
250 odd days into a 3-day special military operation, hoping that basically Russia's meme forces can do the work that their airborne could not.
Yeah, and to the strategic genius, those who are on Twitter who are not following the Darth Putin Twitter account, I would add that to your list, because that's just a, when you can't cry, you just have to laugh kind of thing. But that's a daily dose of the dichotomy between Putin as a master strategist and the utter ruin that this operation has been for him since day one. It does include lots of poop emojis, so consider yourself warned.
And I think poop emojis are a great place to end for the episode.
Yeah, we'll put a bow on. It is the end. That's the sign that we've culminated. All right, Yuval. Well, as always, thank you very much for your time, and we'll get this one out here shortly. Enjoy the weekend, and for those in the audience, I've been putting down some things I'm going to put into the show notes here. Ivan changes professions is going to be one of them. I was looking up on YouTube as we were talking. There is a YouTube version with English subtitles. So for the benefit of the Team Krulak audience, I'm going to give you some extra weekend viewing if you want for your family movie night.
It is quite funny. So it's a very, if you enjoy like movies from like the 60s, so it's not like, so it is of its period, but it's a lot of fun.
Yeah. I the little clips I was scrolling through, it's 60s production values, right? So take that for what it's worth. But I'm also going to throw in, we talked about it offline before, but and I'm not going to make you rehash, sort of literary analysis of Dostoevsky, because I know my own wife would probably keel over with me attempting literary analysis with her background in English and literature as well. But I think there's been a consistent dichotomy between Putin's complaint about, Western values and whatever, label you want to put on it versus, the great, Russian values you have. And one of these dichotomies struck me yesterday, again, on social media, and I'm going to put a link to it. But there was Lieutenant Lyubov Plaksiuk, and I apologize for mispronunciations, but there are pictures of her posted. She's a lieutenant in the Ukrainian military, first woman to lead a artillery unit of the Ukrainian armed forces. And there are these great photo galleries of her standing on the annihilated wreckage of Russian vehicles that her artillery unit absolutely smashed. And I think this ties back to some of the, military performance downstream of overall culture, right? Okay, you want to complain about Western culture, right? Well, Western and Ukrainian modeled military is downstream of their own culture, and they are turning your vehicles into burn hulks on the battlefield. So, you decide which culture is actually going to give you military effectiveness. And if the meat grinder is what you want, then, we'll see how long you have meat left to throw into that grinder. Sorry, we didn't end on poop. We ended on something else. So I'm done. I'm done. Yeah, I'm done now. So, all right. Again, thank you very much, Yuval, and we'll get you here on the next one here shortly. See you.
Bye.
Bye.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.